Hey,
Hey,
hello. Calling Rick Byer in still in Chicago.
wow, Rick Byer in Chicago calling Chris Anderson in London.
I am still in London, and it looks like neither of us have changed our clothes since
I
Christmas
know.
time. So,
What is your problem?
well, I've been
For
jollifying so much that I haven't had time
I
to do
know for
laundry.
1 week I've been wearing this outfit. It is a little
Yeah,
stinky now, but
it is.
it's yeah. Let's just hope they're in on that joke. So, uh, uh, welcome to History Happy Hour, everybody. Brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. Check it out on StephenAmbroseTours.com. It is the
Yes,
first day of
of
2023.
2023, and hopefully you're not feeling too much like the title of our book, "Bloody and Ruined." But I hope you had a good time last night for New Year's.
Yes, it was an excellent time. In fact, it was a multi-hour concert at the Old Town School of Folk Music and a farewell to Rich Warren, who is leaving WFMT
Uh,
as host of Folk Stage and the Midnight Special, and of course his worthy successor on both those
uh.
programs. That would be Marilyn Ray Byers.
So
So
do
we went
folk
for a big
music?
celebration last night.
So do folk music people go wild and crazy, or is it like sedate, or do you like just tap your toes and stay seated when the countdown begins, or do you like leap up with your Birkenstocks and what do you do?
You take a folk instrument like the
Oh, okay.
banjo or the mandolin and you start
Everybody whips out their
swinging it at
spoons
other
at
people.
midnight.
Everybody has one. Everybody has one, and you go crazy, and then you have some chablis or something, and it's really
Okay.
nice. Yeah.
Pinky's out, I hope.
Absolutely.
Okay, good.
Happy New Year's again. And whether you're watching live, watching on replay, listening on the History Happy Hour podcast, or just wondering in general why you are here, thank you for joining us. And we do have an encore episode today with Richard Overy about his epic new history of World War II. Let us know you're here. Let us know what you're drinking. I myself, recovering from a little bit of a hangover,
No, no.
kind of keeping it on the download today, not drinking
Okay.
too
Well,
much.
I do have a beer glass, but anticipating that
It's in a
beer at
high.
this point is not. Yeah, it's at least I'm hydrating, so
The
it's just
beer
water.
is redundant at this
Yeah,
point.
that's
But let us know what you're drinking. And thank you to everybody who supports us via Patreon, especially our top shelf patrons. You can be a Patreon supporter. You can. You can do it in 2023 by going to patreon.com/history happy hour.
thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that's enough falderall.
Folder. Ooh,
Chris, get us going.
okay.
Bing.
Bing. Yes, that was
The
an
bar's
effective
open.
bars
What's
open.
on tap, Chris? What do we got today?
Yeah, I am so excited about this week's show. Joining us this week is Richard Overy. Dr. Overy is a graduate of Cambridge College and a professor of history at the University of Exeter. He is a prolific author, and I mean prolific. He's written a number of definitive works on the Second World War. Amongst them are Why the Allies Won, The Dictators, Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia, The Morbid Age, Britain Between the World Wars, and many, many other great books. And he's the recipient of a number of prestigious awards, among them the Samuel Eliot Morrison Prize from the Society of Military History and the Wolfson History Prize. And he is here with us this week to talk about his new book, Blood and Ruins, The Great Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. So welcome, and thanks so much for joining us, Dr.
Thank
Overy.
you.
So
I,
with this,
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt.
no, go ahead.
Yep, no, so everybody wants to know where you are and what is your cocktail today.
Well, I'm in Brescia in northern Italy, and I'm privileged to be drinking a glass of limoncello.
Awesome.
Very
And
nice. See,
in honor of the leaves, Chris, I have some Oktoberfest.
wow, and I'm just going to let everybody down with a fizzy water, but
You've
I
been on
promise
the
to make
road,
up
busy
for it
day.
later.
We're gonna
Busy
spare
day.
you the criticism.
Oh, thank you. Um, well, getting right into the book because it's a big book and there's lots and lots to talk about. But let's just start with this. Dr. Overy, you say in the introduction to the book, A New History of the Second World War, the history of the Second World War is based on four main assumptions. So, what are the four main assumptions that we should know about as we start this conversation on the book?
Well, I mean, I started off writing this book in a more conventional way, and I began to think about it a lot more as I went on and realized that I had to change my perspective. I wanted to write a book that people would take an interest in. I mean, the first thing is chronology. The conventional war is 1939-1945. In the States, it's really 1941 to 1945. And I wanted to take on board all the violence of the 1930s, starting with Japan's occupation of Manchuria and northern China. And so I decided I would frame the war chronologically in a different way, starting in the early 1930s, going on to, 1945. In fact, it goes beyond 1945, it goes on for the next 10 or 15 years as the rest of the territorial empires in the world, Britain, France, and Netherlands, unraveled. So the chronology is different from the conventional chronology. The second thing I wanted to do was to emphasize how global the war was. History of the First World War is focused entirely on the Western Front, quite wrongly. The story of the Second World War is focused a lot just on Europe and defeat of Hitler. And I wanted to write a book that was really global, to take account of the fact that the war touches every place in the world, from the Aleutian Islands to Madagascar to the Caribbean to the Middle East and so on. It's not just a war in Europe or a war on the Eastern Front. It's a genuinely global war. We have to be able to account for why it is so global. The third thing I wanted to do was to distinguish different kinds of war, because we focus a lot on the military conflict. Rightly, of course, it's very important. But it also occurred to me that we needed to be able to bring in what I've called civilian wars. A lot of the victims of the Second World War were civilians, more in fact than military. Civilians found themselves fighting a variety of different wars, civil defense, for example, against bombing, resistance wars against occupation, civil wars prompted often by the fact of occupation itself in Greece, in Ukraine, in China. And so it seemed to me it was very important to write a book which paid sufficient attention to the variety of wars, and particularly to the way in which civilians were involved. And the fourth thing was really to frame the whole war in an entirely novel way. I've called this the Great Imperial War. The American title actually has the Last Imperial War. But the idea is really to see this war as the end point of a long, long period of European global expansion, violent expansion most of the time, after which the world changed, and we can come on to that perhaps later in the discussion. But we have to see this as a war for empire on the part of Japan and of Italy and of Germany, territorial empire, and a war which was initially fought by empires, the British and the French Empire in particular. Mm-hmm. And in the end, 1945 is about unraveling those empires, ending a 500-year epoch of European global expansion. And it seemed to me that was the way in which we should understand the Second World War, mm-hmm. rather than the conventional way of just seeing it simply in terms of Hitler. Hitler wicked, let's go to war, Hitler defeated. It's a much more complicated question than that.
Yeah. So one of the things that you write, sort of following up on that theme that Chris started, you say the Second World War was a result of decisions taken in London and Paris, not Berlin. And then you say that Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese, military are not causes of the war, but rather effects of the war, which is a really kind of a provocative way to look at it a little bit, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's, if you like, it's deliberately provocative. But we focus so much on Mussolini, Hitler, and the Japanese military. We say it's their fault. There was a stable world, and here they came and messed it all up. And I'm arguing that if you look at the period from before the First World War, look at the First World War and its aftermath, look at the problems of the 1920s and then the economic crash in 1929, 1932, this is a whirling crisis. Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese militarists are, in a sense, a consequence of that broader crisis rather than its cause. And I don't. I think once you think about it, you see that that's the way around. Doesn't mean that they're not responsible, because of course they are, but they're reacting to a situation, and we need to understand what that situation is. And when it comes to 1939. Hitler didn't want to fight the British and the French at that point. He hoped he could get away without fighting anybody for a while. And it was the British and the French who finally said, enough. Your imperial project is too dangerous for us. We're going to stop you. And that was the point at which the war became, more genuinely a global war.
And so, picking up on the idea of empire, you talk about Britain and France being the big imperial powers at the start of this whole process, but then you have Germany, Japan, and Italy kind of striving for their own empires. What was different about, or was there anything different about, their aims and what we call the Axis powers brought to the race for empire? I mean, how was it a new thing, or were they following the same playbook, I guess you'd say?
Well, they were very imitative. They were looking back at the period of violent imperialism, which began roughly in the 1870s, whether it's Africa, the Middle East, Asia. This is a period in which all the powers scramble for territory, and the British and the French and the Dutch already have advantages over the Germans and Italians and the Japanese, but they're all out there trying to get territory, control over resources, strategic outposts, global strategic outposts, and so on. And in the 1920s, that reaches in some ways its apogee, because the British and the French empires become larger than ever with the acquisition of territories in 1919. And the Germans and the Italians and the Japanese particularly feel resentful that they've been left out, that they are not the powers they ought to be, because they saw themselves as great powers, with a civilizing mission, if you like. Mm-hmm. And they didn't see why they shouldn't have a slice of empire as well. And so the 1930s is really about that. It's about, rectifying their position so that they can be imperial powers like the British or the French, echoing a process which has gone on for 50 years.
Mm-hmm. There were two things that I was struck by kind of in relation to that kind of quest for empire on the part of those countries. And one is sort of the idea of imperial fantasies, I think is the phrase you use. That they all three sort of in different ways thought that they were going to get great wealth and benefits from these empires, which did not exactly work out that way. And the second thing, that just had never really occurred to me is that in especially for Japan, and maybe to a lesser extent for Italy and then lesser for Germany, by the time the Allies are involved in the war, they've already suffered a lot of losses, troop losses and resource losses. I think if I remember correctly, Japan had already lost something like 180,000 soldiers against China. So this idea of empire, like they wanted to get in on the good thing, but it wasn't that good.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. The term I use is fantasy empires. It's a term used by a German historian, Peter Kundras, describing the delusion that somehow empire is going to be good for you. Of course, they looked to Britain and France, and the British and the French, controlled, more than a third of the globe, and they were rich because they were imperial powers, and so they assumed that somehow or other you could do the same thing. But the difference from the 1930s is that the countries you choose to attack are all sovereign nations, members of the League of Nations. It's not like the 1870s and 1880s where you push your way into Asia and Africa, into societies that you regard as second class or uncivilized and so on, and you use force to take them over. These are existing nation states, and you have to pretend that China or Eastern Europe or later on Russia or Ethiopia, you have to pretend that this is really colonial space and that you can make your empire there. You can't. It costs a lot. It costs a lot in manpower. It costs a huge amount in simply pacifying the areas that you've taken over. Empire always was difficult, even before 1914. It was costly, often more costly than the advantages you got from it. But these three states never really learned that lesson. They assumed that you could just march out there and eventually the riches would come. They didn't.
Well, and I guess I wanted to ask you, especially that period between the wars. Obviously the Great War, World War One, had been fought. Um, Lots of empire come during that war. Was anybody in the 30s? Wait a minute, there's another way to assert great power status beyond creating these empires.
Sorry, you broke up a bit then. I couldn't quite hear.
Oh, well, I mean, who was? I started saying between the wars, who was saying maybe a different way? There are different ways to assert great power status other than building an empire.
Yeah, I
We
mean,
just finished the first one.
well, they were. Of course, I think we need to remember that the 1930s is a period of real crisis. The crisis is economic at root. The German and Japanese economies were deeply affected by the slump. It's going to take a long time to drag themselves back. And they were almost entirely convinced that the British, the French, and Americans in particular, of course, would be opposed to reintegrating them into a world economy in which they could benefit. Though, of course, that was in fact the answer. And after 1945, that's exactly what happened. But now they assumed that the old world had come to an end. The liberal global economy, capitalist economy, the current geopolitical balance of power. They thought that had come to an end and that they could remodel the world in ways which suited them. And that meant building a territorial and economic bloc which they could dominate and which would satisfy the requirements of their home population, would raise their living standards, would make them less dependent on the Western world. And I mean, we know now, looking at it, that it's a delusion, of course, but at the time, I think, the circles that favored imperialism really thought that that was a possibility. In fact, it was the only possibility to maintain their status as great powers. I said the irony is that after 1945, Italy, Germany, and Japan embarked on their own extraordinary economic miracle. No time at all, Germany and Japan became economic superpowers. Their politics stabilized, and there was another way of doing it, and not the way they chose in the 1930s.
Yeah, one of the things that I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Richard Overy, who is the author of Blood and Ruins, his latest book, which has been described as a single volume history of World War II, and it's not simply a history, but also kind of a little bit of a rumination and an exploration. Because you don't really, I think traditionally when people think of the war, they think of the armies and the military, or they think of even the countries involved. And what really struck me is that you are really looking at the peoples of the entire globe. What happens when the entire globe goes to a war footing, and what are the consequences of that are emotional, economic, social, everything. I mean, this is to me, it was a really eye-opening and different way to look at that war. I don't have a question per se about it, except to say why was that important to you to do that, and did you feel you were able to cover the war and get a new perspective on the war by doing that?
Yes, I mean, it was very important to do. I mean, the first part of the book, of course, provides analytical narrative of the campaigns, but it seemed to me to be able to produce a history of the Second World War which covered the whole experience. What happens to people in the event of war. You need to look at everything, mobilization, economic performance, civilian wars that I've already described, the emotional impact of war. And that's, I think, one of the chapters I enjoyed writing most. Well, it's not enjoyable, but, I found most stimulating. It's really just to examine what the war did to largely civilian armies. These are largely conscripts from civilian life, put into uniform, made to go off and kill each other. And what does that mean? And what does it mean to the people who are being bombed on the ground? What does that mean? How do cities survive, under the impact of bombing? And, you can't do a global history of the Second World War without looking at it in that broader frame. So many of the earlier history of the Second World War, which were very good as military histories, but I mean, basically it was about armies moving here and there, ships moving here and there, divisions being moved on the map and so on. The warfare is much more than that.
Chris, can I do a follow-up on that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was going to say in talking about your chapter on the what you call the emotional geography of the war, you had a quote from a survivor of the siege of Leningrad. Death has become a phenomenon observable at every turn. People are are apathetic. The feeling of pity has vanished. No one cares. And I thought it was interesting. You talked about the civilians who are like in Leningrad who are under siege, but the civilians who have become infantrymen and who you say probably 80. I think I'm throwing out a number. This is not exact, but something like 80% of people who served in the infantry probably ended up with PTSD of some kind or another. And I just thought it was a really interesting to approach the war from that emotional point of view. It's just something I hadn't really considered, beyond an individual here or there.
Well, I think it's very important. It's also a reminder of what war does. I mean, I had hoped that one of the things this book would do would be to remind Europeans, Americans, Japanese, the cost of war, what war really actually does to the people involved in it. And yet here we are again, with war in the Ukraine. People don't learn or don't remember. But the cost of war emotionally is enormous for those who are waiting at home for news, for those who are being besieged, for those who are being bombed, to people in the front line. And there's no doubt that, for ordinary soldiers, this is a traumatic experience. 25% psychiatric casualty rates, the American and Canadian armies and so on, when they first came into combat in Europe in 1944. In Britain, the level was slightly lower, but I mean, it's still, a very high level. A fifth to a quarter of people become psychiatric casualties, and most of them can't be returned to combat because, once you're broken down, it's very difficult to be persuaded that actually you can go back. They go back. They often go back to non-combatant roles. It was only on the Eastern Front or in China that you had you still had the same trauma, but people were not really allowed to break down. The Japanese had almost no psychiatric care for their soldiers. If you broke down, I don't know, you shot yourself or something, but otherwise they expected the Japanese soldier to carry on. And the Soviet Union too, no concept of, really of psychiatric breakdown. Those who broke down, deserted, ran away, cried, were terrified and so on, often end up with a bullet in the back of the head.
So, there's so much here to talk about. So I know these questions might seem a bit random, but there's just so much that's interesting. There's a passage that you have in here that I'd kind of like to get your comment on, moving away from what Rick was asking you about. But this says, you say, from the imperial world, both old and new, the shadows of Lenin and Wilson stalk their ambitions. What do you mean by the shadows of Lenin and Wilson?
Well, 1919 was a very important year, and it was the year, of course, that the Bolsheviks became more established in Russia, and the Comintern was founded, committed to anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. Wilson too was, anti-imperialist, who found it very difficult to unravel the empires, and in fact became, more and more sympathetic to the British and French position than he should have been. But nonetheless, the idea that somehow, American high politics represented something different from empire, and Soviet high politics obviously represented something different from empire. In the 1930s, for the states embarking on a new wave of imperialism, They were always looking over their shoulder. What will the Soviet Union do? What will the United States do? I think I make a point in the book that for all three powers, they thought there was a brief window of opportunity. They would push their way through it quickly in the 1930s, while the Russians were too busy modernizing their economy, while the Americans were isolationists. They would establish their territorial empires, and then they would turn around and say, well, what are you going to do about it? But they were always worried that the Soviet Union and the United States might object. And then they do. The Soviet Union becomes a threat in Eastern Europe. America starts to sanction Japan. And so the Japanese and the Germans decide that the only way they can cope and build their empires is actually to have to fight the Soviet Union and the United States. And that, of course, as you know, was more or less the end of the story.
I share Chris's apology for ping-ponging you around your book a little bit, but we want to try to cover some of the questions we have, and then hopefully we'll be able to bring in some questions from our audience later on. And a few people have been asking about comparisons with Ukraine, and I think we're going to try to save that for a little later in the show. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Holocaust and how you dealt with that in the book. You write that for Hitler, the war and the subsequent steps to Jewish annihilation were inseparable from his war effort and his war aims. Can you expand a little bit on that and your take of how the Holocaust fits into your sort of War of Empires thesis and perspective?
Yes. Well, I mean, the Holocaust is not something which affected the Japanese, the Italians. The Italians had anti-Semitism. The Japanese paid a bit of lip service to what the Germans were doing. But the Holocaust is a unique phenomenon of German imperialism during this period. And it stems from two things, I think, chiefly. The first is that Hitler had, for a long, long time, accepted the geopolitical fantasy that the Jews somehow were a large, powerful international organization that challenged countries like Germany and would undermine them. And the idea of this world Jewish conspiracy was consistent, really, through Hitler's thinking. So you find when war breaks out in September 1939, the first thing he says when he announces war to the German people is that the Jews have been manipulating in Paris and London and have pushed the Western powers into war, which they didn't want. When Roosevelt becomes difficult in 1941, war is looming. Again, Hitler's view entirely is that this is Jews in Washington who are manipulating Roosevelt. He's surrounded by Jews, and what would you expect? Jews in Moscow and Washington and London are all conniving together to strangle Germany's birthright. Now, it's an extraordinary fantasy, and anybody in Germany with an inkling of intelligence would recognize what nonsense this was. But many Germans didn't. Many Germans went along with that fantasy and joined Hitler with that fantasy. The second thing is that the area that Hitler chose for German Empire, Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, is full of Jews. It's where most of Europe's Jews live, where most of the world's Jews lived. And Hitler seems to have been strange actually for an Austrian. The Austrian Empire had large Jewish communities, but he seems never to have really considered this, taking over Austria, then taking over Czechoslovakia, then taking over more than half of Poland, and eventually, of course, attacking the Soviet Union. What do? You bring millions and millions and millions of Jews into your imperial area. And yet the Jews are the enemy of Germany. The Jews are the world enemy. So what do? Well, first of all, you expel them all, hopefully to the Urals, beyond, into Siberia, where they'll all die. But once that becomes clear, you can't do that. What do? You eradicate them. It's the most extreme form, if you like, of imperial genocide. There've been genocides, in the 19th century as well, but nothing like this. What Hitler wanted, and what Himmler and the others working with Hitler wanted, was a Jew-free empire. It didn't make sense to them to have a German empire and then have it full of Jews. And as a result, you set out to eliminate them. First of all, by killing them and putting them in big pits by firing squad, and then, of course, in the extermination camps. But one way or another, what Hitler wanted and his entourage wanted was a Jew-free empire.
Well, and picking up on that, Dr. Overy, is there something about the nature of the war, or the imperial component of the war, that led to it being so vicious? Because it's the Holocaust, but there's brutality against civilians on a scale that is really unsurpassed at this point. Is it something about that drive for empire that causes this, or where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Yeah, no, it is about the drive to empire. I think I make the point in the book that much of the atrocity, whether it's in Ethiopia or whether it's in China or or Southeast Asia, perpetrated by the Germans, the Italians, or the Japanese, and so on, is because they treat this as colonial territory, and they think that you can treat colonial peoples differently, as everybody did before 1914. And that meant not just that they were second-class citizens, subjects, not citizens, but it also meant that you could repress them with an extreme level of violence. And so what you have is, written large, if you like, a typical colonial experience. You want to pacify the area, and if everybody accepted that, that's fine. But when they don't, then you have to use extreme forms of repression. And we have to say that after the Second World War, when the British and the French and the Dutch were trying to save their empires in Malaya, in Kenya, in Algeria, in Indonesia, they used an extreme level of violence, also atrocities, torture, and so on. And in a way, that's the same kind of process. You can treat colonial peoples differently from the way in which you would treat people in the developed world.
And following up on Chris's comment, I mean, one of the things that I was kind of struck dumb by reading was the scale of the Holocaust, and we want to thank Richard for joining us when he is suffering from a cold here. We're really kind of torturing him late at night, forcing him to stay up and talk to us and deal with that. So we appreciate your being here. But the scale of the Holocaust is horrific. But you talk about the Germans' economic plans, which, had they been carried out and had they been victorious, they might have resulted in a extermination of maybe 50 million people in the Soviet Union and the areas that they wanted to turn into the Greater German Empire. It could have been as horrible, and it could have been even more horrible.
They could. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't, in fact, I mean, Jews were the principal target because it just didn't make sense to have a German empire full of Jews. But the idea was just that, there wasn't room for all the Slavs, and the Slavs would have to move east, where they might perish in Siberia, or they might just starve to death. The idea was that you remodeled this entire area biologically to favor the Germans, and if that meant the loss of 30 million people, well, so be it. The same thing is true really in Japan's war in China, although it was less planned than the German ethnic cleansing. For the Japanese too, it didn't matter how many Chinese died. You needed areas for Japanese settlement too, and in the end, an estimated 12, 15 million Chinese died. So these are huge figures. You compare it with the Holocaust, 6 million, but millions and millions of Chinese died. Millions of Russians died too.
And as these powers are trying to expand into empire, do they have a central plan? I mean, do they have this is ultimately what we want, or this is the end state, or are they just kind of stumbling along and and taking what they can get? But I mean, the older histories of World War II are always like, well, they were planning on world domination. Yeah. Is that a central plan, or are they just kind of seeing what they can get away with? Or
yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it is. It's opportunistic because they don't know what they can get away with, and the more they get away with, the more they want. So that Mussolini is very cautious before going into Ethiopia. Once he's conquered it, then intervention in Spain, taking over Albania, thinking about conquering Egypt and Sudan and so on. So the more you get, and the failure of anybody to stop you, the more you think you can get. So there's no clear central plan. But once they're established, the Japanese Empire in China and Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the German Empire stretching right into Russia, into Eurasia, then you do begin to get some central planning. The famous General Plan East, which is drawn up for the ethnic remodeling of the East, the construction really of the German-dominated empire. The Japanese too begin to think in terms of a larger area, the so-called co-prosperity sphere, in which everyone, every country will have an allotted place and so on, and the Japanese will create institutions for dominating the region. Only the Italians can't do that really, because the Italian Empire in Africa is defeated very quickly. The Italians are driven out of Africa. They have, of course, control of part of Greece and part of Yugoslavia, but there's not really the structure there to allow them to develop any real imperial vision. But the Germans and Japanese, I mean, the strange paradox is that, you're fighting a major war now against the major powers of the world, and yet somehow or other you think the empire will survive. So you go on building its institutions, constructing its economy and so on, in the assumption that somehow or other, they'll win, and the other powers will have to accept that there is now a Japanese empire and a German empire. I mean, delusion to start with, a delusion sustained, I think, throughout the period of the war itself.
Yeah.
So, Richard, we have a question from one of our viewers, Lynn Hargrove, who asks, would you say that the roots of both world wars can be found in the Napoleonic Wars? So just when you thought we were going to be getting ready to focus on today and Putin and Russia, no, let's go back to Napoleon, and how much can we blame him for this?
Well, I mean, I've been asked this question before. I think my problem really is there's just too much time and too many historical developments that separate the era of the world wars from what happens in the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, we have a vision of the Napoleonic Wars now that they are much more global and much more total, perhaps, than historians used to think. But there's, in my mind, too much water under the bridge by the time we get to the late 19th century and the new wave of imperialism. In fact, if Napoleon contributed anything, it was to contribute to the modernization of Europe, to shifting European traditions a great deal, opening the way to a more modern age. But that doesn't anticipate, I think, the great wave of violent empire building from the 1870s onwards, because much of that is associated with new phenomena, the rise of mass politics, the rise of industrialization, the development of modern nationalism and so on. And you could date some of those back to the late 18th century, but I don't think it's helpful to do so. And I think we're looking at a distinct phenomenon from the 1870s through to the 1940s.
And so in terms of the war, one of the questions that I always have asked myself as I've read about the war, and I'd very much like to get your thoughts, you have the three Axis powers, and they're trying to build their empires. Clearly, they find themselves at war with most of the rest of the major powers in the world. Given their situation, there seems to be very little coordination between these three empires, or these empire builders, I guess you would say. Why do you think that is? Why wasn't there more coordination?
Yes, I mean, you would expect there to be much more. I mean, historians recently, global historians recently, have begun to find links between the three that we've ignored perhaps in the past, but they're still very limited, with economic aid or whatever it is, compared with what the United States is giving to the Soviet Union or the British Empire. Or the British Empire is giving to other parts of the world. I mean, part of the problem is geographical. It's very difficult to see how they can help each other, particularly once Japan is bogged down in the Pacific and Germany is bogged down in the Soviet Union. I mean, Italy would have liked more help for obvious reasons, but gets extremely limited help. Rommel and the desert, but two divisions. It is a difficult question to answer. I think it is partly geographical, partly that these are all relatively weak economies compared, for example, with the United States and later on the Soviet Union. So there's not a lot they can give each other. The Italians are asking the Germans all the time, more coal, please, more steel, please. And the Germans saying, no, we need coal and steel to fund our own war effort. The big difference with the Allies is that the Allies have control of the seas. So they can move around wherever they want. I mean, submarines interrupt it, but more or less, Britain and later on the United States have control of global communications. And that's a big, big help, both in terms of logistics, providing assistance to distant areas, being able to move troops around where you want to move troops around, being able to conduct your trade, without serious problems. And that meant that collaboration was possible. You could feed the Soviet war machine without the Axis being able to interrupt you. America could feed the British Empire without it being interrupted too seriously, and that's a big contrast, I think, between the two sides.
Chris, I was wondering if you wanted to ask another World War II based question before we devote a little time to comparisons with Ukraine and today.
Well, I would just one question. I mean, it maybe seem sort of obvious, but we've talked about how this drive for empire, leads to war. But how does this drive for empire affect the actual conduct of the war? I know you touch a little bit on, say the relationship between Great Britain and the United States, obviously to have two different attitudes towards empire might be one avenue, but how does just an empire-driven war affect how the war ends up being fought?
I mean, it does for a very obvious reason, because the sites of the conflict are in Eastern Europe, Mediterranean, the Middle East, China, and the Pacific. And the only thing that unites the Allies together is the idea that you end the territorial claims of these three states. And they are territorial claims. The Germans and Japanese are not going to give up territory; they have to be pushed off it. So the strategy of the Allied powers is always dictated by the desire to end the imperial projects of Italy, Japan, and Germany. That's the priority. It's the only thing that unites them, actually, because otherwise there are big differences between the Allied powers for one reason or another. Empire matters, of course, for the British, for the very obvious reason that the British Empire gives the motherland a great deal of assistance. Often played down, I think, in many of the histories, but it's absolutely essential. In the Pacific, it's Australians. In the Middle East, it's Indian soldiers and New Zealanders and South Africans, Canadians. In Italy, it's Canadians. In D-Day, it's Canadians, and that's something which is always overlooked. The British do fight an imperial war, which the Americans don't, of course, nor the Soviet Union. They do fight an imperial war because, without the support of the empire, the British war effort would have been much reduced.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of audience questions, no surprise, bringing up the modern day conflict in Ukraine. And I know this is a topic that you have got from folks before. I think one way the question is phrased is from Jin Latin, who asks, is the war in Ukraine not also an imperial war? And a couple of other people have phrased that in similar ways. Is what Putin is doing, is that an imperial war? And the second thing I would bring up in connection with that is someone who asks, are there parallels between Hitler's beliefs and behavior in the 30s and 40s and those of Putin today? So I'll put those two questions out there, and you can deal with them and other comparison issues of this as you wish.
I mean, for me, it's always a problem because, we're talking about 80 years later and conditions change a lot. Geopolitical conditions change a lot. Politics changes a lot. What Putin's ambitions in the Ukraine are not imperial in the sense in which I was talking about empire before, in which people become subjects, in which they're exploited, which say labor power is used almost like slave labor. Putin's idea is that somehow or other the areas in Ukraine he takes over are inhabited by Russians and Russian speakers who will be happy to be part of Russia. They'll be Russian citizens. In fact, they'll all be Russian citizens, whether they like it or not. They're not. It's not there. They're not conquering the areas in order to exploit them. They will take economic advantage from them, but exploit them in a way in which African or Asian colonies were exploited by the European powers before 1939. So there's a superficial similarity, but I think it's a bit dangerous to simply see it as imperialism. Maybe it's more complex. It's a more complex problem than that. Are there similarities with Hitler? Well, there are similarities. Putin's excuse is that, he's attacked Ukraine because of irredentism, because of Russians who are being persecuted by Ukrainians, just as Hitler attacked Poland because he said there were Germans who were being persecuted by Poles. But I think we need to be cautious about coincidences. I think that the situation in the 2020s is very different to the situation of the 1930s. And I think there's a lot of harking back. Is he Stalin? Is he Hitler? And so on and so on. Is this empire building? And I think that we need to treat it in terms of the 2020s, not in terms of the 1930s. The 2020s, this is Putin, an authoritarian, almost dictatorial figure now, anxious about his domestic popularity, fed up with what Ukraine is doing, insecure at what he sees as a threat from NATO, and reacting accordingly. And these are all conditions dictated by, the post-Cold War era, not dictated by the 1930s.
So, any more on Russia, Rick? Or are we gonna...
Well, I mean, I think that his comments kind of broadly cover the questions that have been brought up. I mean, so.
Well, I've been asked, many times about Soviet imperialism, and there's a strong strain of anti-Sovietism still out there, in the sense that Stalin was the imperialist too. I think that in that case, the imperialist in Poland, in the Baltic states, and so on. But I think in that case, it's misleading, because Stalin wants to extend Soviet power when he can, but he wants to extend Soviet power because he's a communist, and he wants areas to become communist. He wants to liberate the workers and peasants. Of course, there's not much of a liberation from our point of view, but the ambitions that he has is to spread communism where it is possible to spread it. And Hitler openly invites him to push into Eastern Europe under the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact. And what does he do? He starts setting up communist administrations straight away, sending all the capitalists and nationalists and kulaks off to the Gulag. And I think we're in danger again of confusing the two things. For Stalin, the priority is that eventually the world will become communist. And the more you can take bits of territory and turn them communist, the better. That's what he does.
So, kind of picking up on Stalin a bit, one of the fascinating things that you kind of delve into in the book is the question of just war and good war, and how there's a lot of gray in history and not necessarily black and white. And you give lots of examples of that. But maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of the Allies' position to be, in an alliance with Stalin, fighting fascism. When Stalin is probably not somebody you want to invite over for Christmas dinner. And likewise, the British Empire has its own record of being less than kind to its subject people. How do they square that? You have a wonderful quote from, say from W.B. Du Bois, where he says, "There's no Nazi atrocity which the Christian civilizations of Europe had not long been practicing against colored folks in all parts of the world."
Yeah. Indeed.
How are people squaring that?
Yes, well, it's a strange alliance. There's no question it's a strange alliance. I mean, they are, as I said before, I think, committed entirely to eradicating these new empires. And much of it is expressed in terms of anti-fascism, particularly anti-Hitlerism, which is the most powerful sentiment, I think, in the West and in the Soviet Union. And that's how they hold themselves together. But for the Britain and the United States, collaborating with Stalin is not easy because for 2 years before, they've almost regarded Stalin as an ally of Hitler and, as bad as, two dictators as bad as each other. Suddenly, Stalin is holding up German armed forces. And, as long as he does that, then you just swallow hard and say, oh, well, the Soviet Union is not a very nice place. We know that for all kinds of reasons. The public quite likes the Soviet Union because it regards it as a progressive country and so on, as the propaganda suggests. Therefore we stick together. But as soon as you've reached the point where the Axis states are clearly about to be defeated, then that glue begins to become unstuck actually quite quickly. And people, some was very keen, I'd say, well, there was plenty of potential, they could have collaborated and so on and so on. Not until 1947, 48 that, you're really into this crisis. But it's not true. It's already there in 1944 and 45. It's difficult for the British and the Americans to live with the Soviet Union once it's invaded Eastern Europe. They swallow hard because they don't want, the public worldwide to see rifts in the alliance, but the rifts are already developing.
I wonder, you've written a book that really dives into every corner of World War II, and World War II is a topic that's been explored endlessly in a 1,000 or 10,000 books and documentaries and seminars and movies. Writing this book, where does it leave you in terms of your understanding of World War II? Did you feel it changed your understanding? Did you feel there was something, like one thing or one main thing that you took away that kind of just made it make a lot more sense when you were done with it that you didn't feel at the beginning of it?
Well, I didn't feel it at the beginning because, I wasn't quite sure how to approach the book, and I started writing it rather differently and had to stop and jettison quite a lot. Because I was, very impressed by the great wealth of imperial and global history written in the last 10 or 15 years, which is forcing us to think about the Second World War in a different context. And that's what I began to do. And that's what I've done in the book. And coming away from the book, I'm glad I wrote it that way. I mean, I think to my mind, it makes much more sense of a great deal of what's happening in the 1930s and 1940s. It also means that you can link what happens also much earlier with what happens in the Second World War. It also means that 1945 is not the end point, although that's the date on my cover. The end point comes in the 1960s with the end of the Algerian War and the independence of most of colonial Africa and so on. There's a long period of violent withdrawal from empire, and it meant that you could put that in too. Whereas most histories of the Second World War simply talk about, 1945, Nuremberg trials, displaced persons, the onset of a Cold War, and so on, without ever really putting it into that broader global context. I think if I took one thing away that struck me as important, and I began to talk about it more in the book, I think, than I would have done, of course, is that, where does the Chinese superpower begin? We have a Chinese superpower now. And for Chinese historians, the roots of that are in the 1930s and 40s, the onset of the Civil War, the conflict with the Japanese, the triumph of Mao Zedong in 1949, which paved the way for creating what is now the Chinese superpower. And that's, of all the changes which occurred after 1945, that's perhaps the most significant geopolitically. And I think that that's something I've taken away from the book on thinking more about it. I might even perhaps have added more about the Chinese War than I have in the book.
So, picking up on what Rick had asked, when I read this book, there were just so many moments that I was like, now I understand the war so much better, and things that I had questioned seem to make sense. Why do you think it took so long for this kind of interpretation of the event to even be considered? When I first saw the book cover in Imperial War, I thought, what? No.
Yeah.
But then I read it, it makes perfect sense. And why do you think that this hadn't popped up in thought up until you wrote the book?
Well, I think historians tend to work in compartments, and I think for a long time this was military history, with capital M and a capital H, to which a lot of academic historians are prejudiced against military history. So the military history had its own trajectory, talking about the military and about battles and about how they were won, and it's only once you begin to move out from that and begin to take over the material written by social historians, cultural historians, global historians, or most importantly, in this case, imperial historians, that you break down the barriers between those different compartments, and you can come up with a thesis which integrates these different approaches rather than seeing them simply as separate. Historians can be, like many scientists, can be very protective of their frontiers and don't tend to think a lot outside them. And I think that to understand the Second World War fully, you've got to be willing to think outside the box. And I hope that's what I've done with this book.
Absolutely.
Well, Richard Overy, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour and fighting off your cold with the limoncello, and we appreciate that. We want to remind everybody that your new book is Blood and Ruins, The Last Imperial War, 1931 to 1945. It is a big book. It is terrific. So you really should take a look at it. And all of the rave reviews that you've gotten, I think it lives up to every one of them. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure. Thank you.
And we're back and starting off the year with this that great interview we did with Richard Overy.
Uplifting message.
Well, the uplifting message is that there's always a new approach that history can take, or a new way to look at things that casts more light on it. And so that's what was great about that book. Chris, what do we have next week? We're back live. None of this Encore episode stuff, but we're going to be there in the personal live moment
with clean clothes.
With clean clothes.
Change our shirts.
We'll no longer be wearing the same outfits we've been wearing for a week. 2 episodes in a row.
Yeah, right. Well, next week it's really excited. There's a new biography of Josephine Baker, Agent Josephine, and it's some stuff you probably didn't know about one of the most well-known people of the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It's written by Damien Lewis, who's kind of a big wheel over here in Great Britain, and his book about the SAS is now a BBC miniseries, so everybody's talking about him. So we're really excited to have him on the show to talk about Agent Josephine, and we're going to learn some new things about a pretty extraordinary woman.
Yeah, that is going to be a great way to start off our live programming for 2023.
Yeah, absolutely.
And a reminder that you can find all of our archived programs. We've now been doing this almost 3 years.
Get out. Are you serious?
March. 3 years in March.
Right. Like, put the Wayback Machine on. Rick calling me up. Chris, let's have this show where we talk about history, just for a couple of weeks until this whole thing passes over us.
Yeah.
Okay.
And now,
now we've reached fame, fortune, and Disney.
The world is our oyster.
It is.
It is. Anyway, it's been 3 years, and you can watch the episodes. You can listen to them on the History Happy Hour podcast stream, and we just appreciate everybody being there. And we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Yep. Thanks very much, guys. Take care. Be safe, and see you next week.